Dzień dobry Państwu, witam Państwa serdecznie na kolejnym z serii wykładów ekonomicznych prowadzonych przez cyklu wykładów ekonomicznych prowadzonych przez pana profesora Jerzego Osiadnickiego. Cykl wykładów, przy którym partnerem jest Fundacja imienia Róży Luksemburg, dzięki której w dużej mierze to wydarzenie może się odbyć. Dziś naszym gościem jest pan profesor Malcolm Sawyer, którego za chwilę bliżej przedstawi Państwu profesor Jerzy Osiadnicki. Profesor będzie mówił o pakcie fiskalnym i o jego implikacjach dla dalszego trwania bądź nie trwania strefy euro w jej obecnym kształcie. I zarazem chciałbym od razu zaprosić Państwa na kolejny wykład Fryderyka Spieker, który odbędzie się w dniu 5 grudnia. I przekazuję głos panu profesorowi Jerzemu Osiadnickiemu.
Dobry wieczór Państwu. Ja myślę, Panie Michale, że ten pierwszy wstęp w audytorium jest jednak przede wszystkim polskie, to ja zrobię po polsku. A potem już będziemy, jak zawsze, mówili po angielsku. Dzisiejszym gościem jest pan profesor Malcolm Sawyer, ekonomista brytyjski szkoły post-Keynesian, post-Kaleckie. Pan profesor Sawyer przez wiele lat pracował na Uniwersytecie Leeds, wcześniej na Uniwersytecie w Yorku. Jest autorem pierwszej na świecie całościowej monografii dzieł Michała Kaleckiego. Książka, którą napisał, nazywa się The Economics of Michał Kalecki i była opublikowana w 1985 roku. Obecnie zajmuje się problematyką współczesnej gospodarki kapitalistycznej, zwłaszcza finansjalizacji tej gospodarki. Zajmuje się problematyką przepływów finansowych, prowadzi dwa blogi, publikuje na łamach dziennika Guardian. Jego blogi to Triple Crisis i Back to Full Employment. Zgodnie z tradycją ekonomii keynesowskiej i post-keynesowskiej perspektywa badawcza profesora Sawyera to jest, czy i jak gospodarka rynkowa może utrzymywać pełne zatrudnienie. Profesor Sawyer opublikował wiele książek, głównie wydawanych przez wydawnictwo Edward Elgar, znane z takiego lewicowego pochylenia właśnie w kierunku ekonomii rozumianej jako nauka społeczna. Pisze także w International Review of Applied Economics i w International Papers in Political Economy. Malcolm, excuse me for having this introduction in Polish, but I just summarized your output. Now I think it's time we turn to the critical issue for our tonight's meeting, i.e. what could be the results of fiscal compact from the viewpoint of the future of the economic and monetary union. The question that Professor Sawyer asks are crucial. Is the medicine which we apply in the hope that it will cure the present imbalances within the European Union, and especially within the euro area, do the trick? Or would it prove even more harmful than the present disease that for the last several years we've seen in the Eurozone. Malcolm, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this invitation to come and speak to you. I very much appreciate it and enjoy being back in Warsaw after many years of absence. It is perhaps a little odd that I am coming from the United Kingdom to speak to you in Poland about the euro, and neither of us are members of the euro and its future, but I think it doesn't take little to see that we are both countries are going to be highly affected by what is happening in the eurozone, and particularly as Professor Malcolm just indicated, the present policies that are being applied in the eurozone are going to affect the functioning of the euro. It's going to have backlash effects upon our countries, and I think in the case of Poland, you have signed up to the Treaty on Stability, Governance and Coordination, which includes the Fiscal Compact, so that the imposition of various budget requirements apply to yourselves. The UK secured an opt-out from that, but so it does apply across the board. So what I want to talk about are set out on that introduction. I want to look at the nature of the Fiscal Compact, which is governing or coming into effect in the Economic and Monetary Union. A particular part of that Fiscal Compact, which was signed up to last year, is the idea of having a balanced structural budget. Now that may sound a bit kind of technical, but what it means is the idea that government budgets have to be effectively in balance. Now that contrasts with most of the time when most governments run budget deficits. And one can ask the question, why should we strive for a balanced budget? Now some of you may say, well, that's kind of obvious. We can't allow deficits to go on forever. We can't allow debts to accumulate. But looking at the other way around, you might say, well, why have governments run budget deficits? Well, it's basically been to underpin the level of demand in the economy, to underpin the level of economic activity in the economy. So trying to reduce the budget deficits will have harmful effects, I will argue, on the economic consequences, economic performance. Then I want to go on and ask the question that since I see from the application of the Fiscal Compact that there will be all sorts of deflationary effects, that is, we'll be applying austerity, and austerity will either cause unemployment to increase further in many countries, particularly the Mediterranean countries, but at best it will prevent the any recovery taking place, so that it will prevent unemployment falling, even if it doesn't actually increase it. So then that leads me on to really to say, can this Fiscal Compact last? And I want to look at that in sort of two directions. One is whether the policy which is being applied in the end just will not work. It will just not be possible to have a balanced budget. The second, and in some sense perhaps a more important question, is will it be able to survive politically? That is, at what point does the riots in the streets in Greece, in effect, stop the policies? How much longer can those austerity continue? Then I will want to sketch out some alternative policies for the Economic and Monetary Union. Now, in talking about that, I feel that the economic and monetary union has reached, so that's the Eurozone, has reached an impasse. It was set up without thought for many of the problems which would arise. It has imposed a set of policies on fiscal austerity, on the way in which the European Central Bank operates, and many other things, which do not allow the Eurozone to function well. But at the same time, when we start thinking about what are the alternatives, how could the Eurozone, in a sense, be reconstructed, we see that almost all of the policy proposals that one might put forward are, in effect, politically impossible. They are so far off of the political agenda. They will face so many political obstacles, but we just cannot see them coming about. So just to give you an example of that, I will argue that a substantial budget at the European level is required. That is, substantial taxes raised by the European Union, substantial expenditure undertaken by them in the areas of, for example, supporting investment in countries and so forth. But I think it doesn't need me to tell you that the idea that the European Union budget should be increased by 5-fold or 10-fold, which is the sort of orders of magnitude we will be thinking about, is just so far off the political agenda to be infeasible. But if something like that doesn't happen, I would argue that it's going to be very difficult for the Eurozone to function in a prosperous way. I think the Euro would survive because the political commitment to its survival is very strong, but it would not be combined with economic prosperity, wouldn't be combined with anything approaching full employment. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Okay. Let me start by outlining what is in the fiscal compact, what it is that Poland and many other countries have signed up to in terms of its operation. And I think there are a number of aspects of this which are going to be rather important. Now, you may recall by way of background that when the Eurozone was formed, the countries that were joining signed up to the Stability and Growth Pact. And part of the Stability and Growth Pact was that national governments would not run budget deficits which were more than 3% of gross domestic product, and that on average they would balance their budgets, that they would also keep their debt levels below 60% of GDP. And as it turned out, most of those conditions were at some point broken. Germany and France were, I think, the first countries in 2004 to break the 3% limit. Most countries broke the 60% debt to GDP ratio. So it was seen that those countries, the Stability and Growth Pact in some sense had not worked, it hadn't actually been implemented. And that although countries had broken the rules, they, with one or two exceptions, had not been punished for doing so. When the recession came, the Great Recession following the financial crisis came in 2008, 2009, then budget deficits rose substantially because tax revenues fell and budget deficits rise. And it was thought that governments had limited ways of responding to that because they were already running deficits. Now, I think that's actually not correct, but that was, I think, the feeling. So the fiscal compact had the idea of firstly making the rules governing budget deficits much more rigorous, and also seeking to ensure that if it was broken, there would be penalties, that the commitment to the rules under the fiscal compact should be put into national constitutions or similar, so it would make it very difficult to change. I think one could say along that there's a certain anti-democratic element in putting it into a national constitution. I mean, one could say, well, it is democratic in the sense that people elect for it to go into the national constitution or vote for it, but it does then make it much more difficult in future to pursue other sorts of policies. So it becomes very difficult, for example, for a political party to campaign on the basis that it's going to increase public expenditure or cut taxes, because it would break the fiscal compact and therefore it would be ruled illegal, as it were, under the constitution. It also had another element which I think also becomes rather important, which is that it includes what is called an excessive deficit procedure. That is, if a country's debt is more than 60% of GDP, then the country has to run surpluses on their budget in order to reduce that debt towards the target of 60%. Now that means that the fiscal compact is imposing more deflation on many countries. So a country like Greece, which has a debt ratio, I think it's now 150% of GDP or thereabouts, would have to be running budget surpluses of 3, 4, 5% of GDP. So their tax revenues would have to be that much greater than expenditure. And the only way you're going to get that is by slashing expenditure or raising taxes. Now, there's one other important feature which was linked with the excessive deficit procedure, which I think is sort of like crept under the radar, that people don't notice it very much, but I think it is actually rather important, which is that the European Commission can impose what are usually called structural reforms on countries. As part of the procedures for reducing their debt and so on, they can have imposed upon them structural reforms. Structural reforms sound kind of nice and friendly in a way, because who could be against reform? You know, changing your structures, reform, it sounds something which is going to be beneficial. But structural reforms really mean deregulation of the labour market, reduction in trade union rights, cutting minimum wages, cutting welfare, all those that are sort of policies which are being imposed by the Troika on Greece, for example. Now this, within the context of the European Union and its general policies, I think is an important, very significant step, because it is saying what is the sort of labour markets that are to be kind of preferred. That is to have so-called very flexible, deregulated labour markets rather than regulated labour markets in which trade unions and others have their rights and responsibilities. That to have a labour market in which wages can change quickly rather than having a labour market in which there are long-term contracts which foster training and so forth. So it is imposing essentially a neoliberal agenda on countries as part of this fiscal compact. Now, I'm not going to say any more about that tonight, but I think it is an important element in the direction in which the European Union is moving. Let me though move back to what in some sense is the centrepiece of the fiscal compact, which is the imposition of a structural budget deficit rule. Now again, this may sound sort of rather technical, but what it means is that a government should seek to have a balanced budget which is consistent with the economy operating what is often called potential output. So when the economy is operating at kind of average levels of output, then the budget should be balanced. However, there is another underlying that, that this is imposed as a rule. Now, of course, most of the time, the economy is not operating at the average level of output. Rather, it's sometimes above, sometimes below. But in order to impose this rule, there has to be some way of calculating what the budget would be if the economy were operating at potential output. Now again, that may sound a bit arcane, but if we think about what it means, firstly there are, and I'm not going to go really here into, there are all sorts of technical difficulties of making that estimation. However, I think there's two particular points to note about it. Firstly, who decides whether a country is reaching this rule? Who calculates what the budget would be if the economy were operating at the average level of output? Now recall also that if a government does not meet that rule, it is breaking its constitutional requirements. There are penalties in place if it doesn't reach that. So who makes that calculation becomes rather important. It will actually, the calculation will be made by the bureaucrats in Brussels. Now what we also know is that different experts calculate that budget, that structural budget, in different ways. In a paper which we're currently working on, what we've shown is that the budget calculations that are made by IMF, OECD, European Union, are different. Not surprisingly, perhaps. But out of that, one of them, in this case the European Commission, is going to say that is the right calculation and you better keep to it. Now there is also a further difficulty. I talked about the budget deficit being in place at the average level of output. Now somehow I slightly misled you there, because the formal position is that it's what would the budget be if the economy were operating at potential output. Now potential output is again a kind of technical term, but if you ask me how is that potential output calculated, it is calculated from the level of unemployment which would hold inflation constant. What is technically the NAIRA, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Currently, the estimate of that concept for Spain is 23% unemployment. So what that would be saying is that it would be, for the Spanish economy, we will calculate what the budget would be at 23% unemployment, and that's what you should be aiming for. So 23% unemployment now becomes acceptable. It is saying that if the economy operates at 23% unemployment and the budget is balanced, that's all fine. And that to me seems to be somewhat unacceptable, should we say. So there are, although balancing the structural budget deficit may sound rather technical and arcane, it does carry within it two important features. One is that the calculations on it are done by bureaucrats in Brussels and imposed upon the country, whatever they think. So if the experts in the country concerned say, no, that's not tough, they have to accept it. I do think sometimes, though, possibly this provides an outlet for a number of us to be gainfully employed, because if the matter is taken to court, then we could go along and say, actually, that calculation is wrong, this should be the one that you are using. So we could go along as independent experts sort of thing on that. But I think there is that problem of imposing it. But the second one, and I think this is much more important, that the calculation is being done at what might be regarded as horrendous levels of unemployment. And that, trying to balance the budget at 23% unemployment, which is what it would amount to in Spain at the moment, is just not acceptable. So that I've mentioned now two particular aspects of the fiscal compact which I think are going to have bad effects. One is the deflationary impact of the excessive deficit procedure, having to run large budget surpluses and also trying to balance the budget overall. And the other one is this nature and role of structural reform, what it is going to be doing as it were to the labour market and how it operates. There is a third one, which is the first one on this list, which is what could be called the imposition of a one-size-fits-all problem. Now this is a problem, in a sense, which bedevils the operation of the single currency right across the board. Because after all, what the single currency does is to bring together now 18 countries into one area. Now what, in a sense, we know, and we would know also just from our own countries, is that setting a policy which is going to apply across the whole country runs into the problem that that policy may be suitable for one part of the country but not for the other. Now, quite a few years ago, the Governor of the Bank of England, as it then was, and not the present one or the previous one, but the one before that, ran into some difficulties because he made the observation that when he was raising interest rates at that time, it was because London and the southeast of England was overheating, but, as he put it, I think the northeast of England was still shivering, still cold. And so he was just pointing out that if you have a common monetary policy, a common interest rate, it may suit some parts of the country, but it doesn't suit others. And that's sort of an inevitable problem. But now within the Eurozone, that is much worse because the countries are much more dispersed, diverse, they're much more difficult, often in much more different circumstances. But also, the countries differ in terms of their institutional arrangements. They differ in their policies, they differ in their histories. But just to give an example, or maybe I'll give two examples, with relation to monetary policy. One is that we know that monetary policy, changing interest rates, can have a particular effect upon the housing market. Because if people are buying houses, then obviously they're borrowing, and costs of borrowing and the availability of credit is rather important to that. But the extent of home ownership, the way that mortgages are arranged, differs substantially between countries. So the effect of changing the interest rate has a much greater effect in some countries than in others. Now the second, and one of the ways in which this really can have a really have a disastrous effect in the context of the Eurozone was that during the mid-2000s there were some countries, Ireland and Spain being two notable examples, which were going through the most enormous construction and housing boom. It was partly because money was sort of pouring into the country, so the credit was freely available at low interest rates, and that fed into a housing boom which eventually burst with disastrous consequences. Yet there was nothing that could be done about that through monetary policy, because the ECB was sat there changing interest rates across the board. It couldn't do so directed at Spain or Ireland to deal with that boom. Now, in the context in which I'm talking now, in terms of one size fits all, what the Fiscal Compact is doing, what the Stability and Growth Pact before it did, is to say you must basically apply the same budgetary policies, the same fiscal policy across the board. You must you must achieve a balanced structural budget no matter what your circumstances are. Now let us think of what that means. And I think it means, or at least I'll point to two things it means. One is it means that a country is supposed to balance its budget no matter what its requirements are for public investment. Now, quite often, people will advocate that a government should be able to borrow if it is undertaking public investment. And indeed, that idea was built into the German constitution, that there was a limit on what the government could borrow, but it was limited to what it was undertaking by way of public investment. It changed that rule, that constitutional requirement, I think in 2006, 2007, to say it has to now balance the budget and not borrow even for public investment purposes. So if you take the view that governments should borrow for public investment purposes, or that's a legitimate, if you like, reason for borrowing, then to impose a rule that you can't borrow for public investment seems rather crazy. It doesn't take any account of what the requirements are for a country. I mean, some countries will have much greater need for public investment in schools, hospitals, infrastructure, transport and so forth than others. Yet to impose the same rule across the board, to me, doesn't make very much sense. Now, the other end, this is a somewhat, now a bit of a technical argument, but I hope you bear with me. If the government is borrowing, then it has to be lending from the government is borrowing, then the private sector has to be lending. Therefore, where does the government get its funds from if it's not borrowing from the non-government sector? Now, it can borrow in one of two ways. It can borrow from the domestic economy, and or it can borrow from overseas. Now, countries differ very substantially in how much they want to save and how much they want to invest. They differ very markedly in how much they can borrow from abroad or lend abroad. If we go back to 2007, because this is where the figures probably are the sharpest, Germany was running a current account surplus, I think of 6 or 7% of GDP. Greece was running a current account deficit of 15% of GDP. So Germany was lending 6 to 7% of GDP abroad, and Greece was borrowing. In the case of Germany, Germany was saving a great deal more than it was investing. Greece was the reverse. Now, if you have different current account deficits, different capital inflows or outflows from abroad, if there are differences in savings and investment, this implies as a matter of logic or accounting that the budget deficit will be different. technically, the budget deficit has to be equal to the difference between what the private sector is saving and investing plus what is being borrowed from abroad. But if countries are in very different positions, then they have different requirements over the budget deficit. So again, to impose the same rule on all, then to me doesn't make makes very little sense. Now, perhaps to illustrate that, I'll take the case of the United States in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. In the late 1990s, the United States was running a budget surplus. And this was put down by Clinton and others to the measures which Clinton had adopted, policy measures. And the calculations were being undertaken that by 2014, the national debt of the United States would have been paid off because they would have been running surpluses. And they then started to think about what would they do in 2014, and I think they suddenly realised that if you paid off all the debt, the next thing you do, the government does, is to start buying out private industry. And the idea of them having to nationalise them, I think, maybe got a bit scary. But quite soon afterwards, the American government didn't continue with that surplus and it went into deficit. And you might say, why was the United States running a budget surplus in the late 1990s? Very simple. Investment was very strong. It was part of the dot-com bubble, dot-com boom. But not only was there a dot-com boom, but there was a lot of investment taking place into IT infrastructure, so that was causing investment to be high, savings was relatively low, and the accounting consequence of that was that there was a budget surplus. 5 years later, the dot-com bubble had ended, investment had slumped, and they went back into deficit. So what the United States, in some sense, kind of required in terms of its budget position, did depend on what was happening to investment. Now, across countries, investment demands and requirements vary very considerably. It also varies considerably in terms of how much they are saving. So again, to impose the same rule on all doesn't make, to me, a great deal of sense. Now, I'm going to skip over those. Now this is the algebraic expression of what I've just been saying, which is saying that the budget deficit is equal to private savings minus investment plus the current account position. And what I draw out of that is the idea that what is an appropriate budget deficit depends upon many other circumstances in the countries concerned. Now let me turn to a kind of related point. You may recall I made the point that the fiscal compact would involve the structural budget being pretty much in balance. Now if you look at that formula which I put up there, if the budget deficit on the left-hand side is 0, which is what the aim would be for a balanced budget, then it says that the relationship between savings and investment and the current account have also to be 0. one of the major points I draw from Mikhail Kalecki is that there is often a tendency for savings to exceed investment. That savings decisions are made by households and firms, investment decisions are made by firms, but those investment decisions depend upon really likely the growth of the economy, the prospects for growth of the economy, their expectations about the future, animal spirits, and to use Keynes's phrase. And there's no reason on earth why savings and investment should be equal to one another. They are independent decisions made, driven by quite different motives, and much of the time, I would say, there's a tendency for savings to exceed investment. Consequently, there's essentially generally a requirement for the budget to be in deficit. Now let me back that up by firstly saying, I don't think I've got the figures here, but if you look at the post-war experience, then in most years, most countries run budget deficits. In the case of the UK, in the last 60 years, it has been in deficit 55 years out of 60. I don't know what the precise count for Germany is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is not similar. But Germany has a 60% or over 60% debt to GDP ratio. How do you get to having a debt ratio of 60% if you haven't run deficits year after year? Indeed, you can do a quick calculation that to have a 60% debt ratio means that on average you've had around about a 3% of GDP deficit. So most of the time Germany has had a budget deficit. Now, I think some of my German colleagues will say, at least the five Kaleckian Keynesian economists in Germany, that what is called the debt brake in Germany, which requires that the German, not only the federal government but also the Länder government balance their budgets, will bring, in the end, disaster to Germany, because they will be trying to pursue a much more deflationary, austere set of policies than they have done in the last 60 years. That, sorry, may not be very easy to see, but that indicates the budget positions in member countries of the Euro area since 1998, and I think you can see two things. One is that they are different between countries, and secondly, they are predominantly below the line, i.e. that they are predominantly in deficits. And you can also see how the deficits increased, how they plunged downwards in 2008, 2009 when the recession came. So that illustrates that budgets have typically been in deficit, and also that there are marked differences between countries, which to my mind makes it more difficult now to impose the same rule upon all countries. That is the current account positions, and again, that is essentially the trade deficit, the trade surplus or deficits, not a little bit more than that, but we think of it in those terms. And again, you can see that those are markedly different. And indeed, in some respects, I would say that this is one of the crucial problems of the Euro area. My economic history is not always that good, but I think that disparity in current account positions may be almost historically unprecedented. To have some countries running surpluses of 6, 7, 8% of GDP, and others running deficits in double digits, is, I find kind of remarkable. Now, as a bit of an aside, if some countries are running surpluses and others are running deficits, then those that are running surpluses will be lending to those that are running deficits. Again, some of the problems which arose in the Eurozone really came from that Germany, Netherlands, and so forth haven't been lending to Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and when the crunch came, many of those loans that they've been making went bad. Now, in terms of the fiscal compact, it would be, in my view, difficult to achieve the same budget outcomes in countries when they run such different trade positions. Yet, there is no way of resolving those trade imbalances. You may have seen sort of overnight that the European Commission has raised the question of the large German surplus. Now, I think it was 6.5% of GDP and the consequences for that. I find it interesting to know where that is kind of coming from. You know, what is it? At last, they have realised that the German drive to have current account surpluses is having all sorts of detrimental effects upon the operation of the Eurozone. Now, I think probably beginning to start running out of time. Let me just move on to two other parts. The second point I put there is the fiscal compact is the pursuit of the unachievable. What do I mean by that is that I would argue that historic experience, theoretical arguments point that to have a balanced budget and a balanced budget at a reasonable level of economic activity, at a reasonable level of unemployment, is not generally possible. So if countries are all pushed in the direction of seeking to have a balanced budget, when that balanced budget cannot actually be achieved, promises disaster. Because what you do in trying to pursue that, well, you cut expenditure, you raise taxes. Now, in the context of the Eurozone, of course, there are, in a sense, cumulative effects, because if one country is cutting its expenditure and going through deflation, then that country is buying from other countries, and so its imports will be diminished, and that means that the exports of other countries are going to be diminished. And so it will have that kind of cumulative effect. So my particular argument about the fiscal compact is that it imposes this common set of rules, that it imposes a rule, the balanced budget, which will not actually be achievable. In trying to achieve it, it will bring all sorts of austerity and deflation about, which in the context of the Eurozone will be cumulatively destructive. Let me, by way of the last 5 minutes, or just talk a little bit about possible alternatives. But perhaps just to summarise what I've been saying. The particular set of arguments I would have against the fiscal compact and why it will bring, I think, in the end, disaster, is that it imposes, or seeks to impose, so-called structural reforms. It seeks to impose further austerity and deflation on countries, and that will not, in the end, be achievable. But at the same time, the countries have locked themselves in to this fiscal compact because they have changed their constitution, they've signed up to the treaty, so that punishments are involved if the budget rules are not obeyed. So the pressures will be there to do so, but that will be actually unachievable. And in the end, I think it will collapse. And in the case of the Stability and Growth Pact, you could say it took 3 years before it was realised that it didn't operate. If you take the start of the euro, well, we could say it was 1999 as a virtual currency, 2002 as a circulating currency. It was 2004 when Germany and France breached the terms of the Stability and Growth Pact, and in 2005 there was some modifications made to the Stability and Growth Pact, which supposed to ease it, but it didn't, I think, make very much difference to how the policy was operated. I'm not sure whether I want to stick my neck out enough to say it will be about 3 years before something similar happens, that it is realised that trying to achieve these balanced budgets is having detrimental effect and cannot come about. But how they then unwind that by how do they change the constitutions? You can imagine the problems which arise in Germany if they start trying to change the constitution to take up the debt brake, which is the counterpart of this. Now, is there any alternative? I want to suggest that there is an alternative which would, I think, be quite consistent with the work of Michał Kalecki, but as we have found over the years, this may well be politically infeasible to take and to come about. And I think it's politically infeasible, or maybe politically infeasible, or face political obstacles in 2 ways. One is that the sort of policies which I would be wanting to recommend would represent a large ideological shift in the approach to economic policies within the Eurozone. The current policies, in terms of, for example, independence of the central bank, the fiscal consolidation type movements, the austerity programs, are all deeply embedded within the operations of the European Commission. It is their sort of ideological framework, thinking about it. The sort of policies which I and many others would want to advocate are a major shift away from that. Secondly, these policies, and this is where the other political obstacles come from, these policies involve transfers of resources from rich to poor. They involve a transfer of powers from nation states to central authorities, and we know what the obstacles that will be faced there. Let me suggest, though, that there are 4 elements of an alternative. I think there are many others as well, but 4 particular ones. First, to set national budgets along what I would here call functional finance lines. Now, functional finance, in a sense, is a technical term. Okay? It was an idea put forward by an American economist called Lerner back in 1943. Very similar ideas were put forward by Michał Kalecki, which is that the purpose of fiscal policy, the purpose of the balance between tax and expenditure, the purpose of budget deficits is not to balance them. The purpose is to secure the highest feasible level of employment. If that requires a large deficit, so be it. If it requires a large surplus, so be it. But the purpose of policy should not be balancing the books. From the government's point of view, it should be balancing the economy. And balancing the economy, in my mind, means high levels of employment, amongst other things, many other things as well. So the purpose of policy, the purpose of budget deficits, should be to secure the highest level of employment that is feasible and sustainable in the economy. I'm going to exactly what that would entail. Now, in the context of the Eurozone, I think this means 2 things. Firstly, it means an agreement, as it were, amongst governments that that is the sort of policies they're going to pursue. And secondly, it requires that the European Central Bank gives support to those policies. So it means the European Central Bank doesn't keep complaining in its monthly reviews, we've got to have fiscal consolidation. it doesn't mean, it means that the European Central Bank doesn't simply say we're not going to buy the bonds of that government. It means supporting the policies in the sense of always being prepared to accept that government debt as collateral, for example, so it doesn't, so it supports it in that sense. Now, to some extent, that might be almost like an interim measure, because I think there's a strong argument for the development of a very substantial federal budget, which would transfer resources between states, because if you have a, say, a common tax policy, then it will raise more money in the rich countries than in poor countries. If you, and often we make the comparison, I suppose, between Europe and the United States. In the United States, there are really quite substantial transfers of resources between the richest states and the poorest states. And in some, and I think it ranges from some where for every, is where the state, for every dollar it pays into the federal, or people from its state pay into the federal budget, it receives 2 back. To others where for every dollar that's paid in, they receive about half a dollar back. And this involves transfers between states. I always find it somewhat ironic that I think much of that transfer is transfer from rich democratic states, or democratic voting states, to poorer Republican voting states. It is always a bit, I think, paradoxical, but I think that's the way it probably works. Now, the federal budget partly sort of stable, or helps to stabilise to some extent income and activity across countries, but also if the federal government runs a fiscal policy, can also overall stabilise it. Now, I sometimes think that what is required has quite a lot of parallels with the New Deal, which was introduced by Roosevelt during the 1930s. What did that include? It included a federal social security system. It included Glass-Steagall banking reform. It included some extension of trade union rights. It included a much more substantial federal budget, which then grew partly because of war. But many of those measures are the type of measure which I think are required within the Economic and Monetary Union. 2 others, just to finish. One of those is to make much greater use of the European Investment Bank. The European Investment Bank, if I recall the figures rightly, borrows and then lends to governments and to companies, I think of the order of 1% of European Union GDP. Its ability to raise funds in the market has recently, I think, been extended, but there could be much greater use made of the European Investment Bank, which would have the advantage that those funds could be channeled into, of course, productive usage, and also focused upon the poorer, less prosperous areas where there's more need for investment and so forth. Finally, there's a need to address what I call here the structural imbalances. That is, that some countries are running large current account deficits and others large current account surpluses. If we take the example of Greece, as the figures I've put up earlier, it was running a deficit of over 15% of GDP. That, in my view, is just not sustainable. You cannot go on forever borrowing that sort of amount. Yet, the deficit in Greece has come down, but it's come down at the expense of 25% unemployment and huge recession by reducing domestic income and so domestic demand for imports. That, I think, is just unacceptable. How would, for example, Greece overcome those imbalances? Well, one way it is first trying to do so again is by cutting wages. That I don't think is having a great deal of effect, but what it means more than anything else is the building up of its industries. The ability of Greece to export is going to be limited to us going there to get the sun and to buying olive oil in the present rain. That's rather flippant, but it needs its sort of industries and so forth building up in order to address, amongst other things, those structural imbalances. Now that can be linked with the role of the European Investment Bank, because that is an element of providing those sort of funds. But the policies should be focused upon building up industries, building up competitiveness and so forth in order to address those structural imbalances. In summary, this will be a part programme for a major reflation of the European economies. That by itself is not sufficient, but it does require also the building up of capacity, the building up of employment opportunities as well as demand. But if one is always reducing demand, then that's never going to increase employment and economic prosperity. And so a new, let me call it a New Deal, is what is required in the context of the economic and monetary union. But the pessimistic side of me says that the political obstacles to that are immense.
Thank you, Malcolm. Now, okay, we come to the questions and answers part of our tonight's meeting. Please, can you please? Oh yes.
Thank you, Professor, for your excellent presentation. I'm from the National Bank, Andrzej. You are talking about budget deficit, but let us touch the problem of putting some cap on the public debt to GDP ratio. What is your attitude to the proposal put forward by Richard Koo that public debt should be somehow related to the domestic savings? Because under such circumstances, you are safe. The example is Germany, that even with massive widening of budget deficit in Germany, investors were not frightened because German bonds would be bought otherwise by domestic institutions. It is one proposal. And the second was not even proposal but suggestion put by Josh Eisenman that the public debt to GDP ratio should be somehow related not to GDP but to tax base. For example, we have Panama and Austria. It was Josh example, and in both countries the ratio of public debt to GDP is 60%, but the tax base in Austria is 50%, and in Panama is 10%. So, yeah, thank you.
Should we take one by one?
Up to you.
Okay, go ahead.
I rather come from the view that the public debt to
Can you
GDP,
use the microphone?
that the in some ways the public debt to GDP ratio is not of particular significance. In part, I think go along with the idea that there's some level of public debt to GDP after which growth deteriorates or prosperity goes down the drain. They partly base that on, well, let me just start with the example of the UK in 1945 had a debt ratio of 250% of GDP, then launched into its most fastest growth period in history. It managed to nationalise many industries, establish the welfare state and so forth. But also I would cast doubt on the sort of correlations which are being done between public debts to GDP and growth performance and so forth. But I would see the public debt, first of course, it's the accumulation of past deficits. And if past deficits have been, as it were, run for the right reasons, that is, by that I mean that a deficit has been run not because the government wants to be profligate, but because, in effect, there's an excess of savings over investment, so that the deficit has been used in order to sustain the level of demand in the economy, then as Koletsky pointed out, if there's an excess of savings over investment, or the propensity to save is greater than the propensity to invest, then the funds are there as were available to be lent to government. The reason the government is running the deficit is because the private sector wants to save. So that in that sense, the public debt is willingly held because people wanted to save in the past, and the only way they could do so was by acquiring debt. Now, where I think it may be more of an issue is the degree to which that public debt is held overseas, and the degree to which it's not so much the public debt as such as the debt of that country in international terms. So if the debt is owed by foreigners, whether it's owed by the government or by private individuals, that can then be much more of an issue, because if you have debt to foreigners, then typically you've got to find foreign currency in order to meet those debt obligations. So I would see that as much more of an issue. And particularly, there's perhaps not the sort of thing one says in polite circles, but when a country has its own currency, and when it has a central bank which is able to issue that currency, it never need default, because, to put it crudely, it can print the money to meet the debt. It's not something which one may want to particularly advocate, but so long as the government has the ability to tax and, if need be, to issue the currency, then it can always meet its debt obligations, provided those debt obligations are in the national currency. But the main argument I would put is that one has to inquire into the reasons why the debt was built up. It's been built up because deficits have been, let me say, run wisely, and I don't see it as a particular problem.
Thank you. Next question, please. Yes, please.
My question is that you say that is, in your view, this fiscal compact, you call it, is not possible to maintain, because it's impossible to put together into one pot, into one thing, very different countries in Europe which behave. Because different countries, not only because of their economy, but different countries because of their political behavior. Like Greece, I mean, it is possible that the Spaniards, and the Greece, they accept an unemployment of 15%. It might be normal to say. In Sweden or in Germany or in Austria, you cannot have it. It would lead to a sort of revolution. So if this fiscal compact is not possible to maintain, is it possible to keep on with the common currency without this fiscal compact? Because if to a common currency you need a fiscal compact, and if you cannot have it, so the current currency is a currency, the common currency doesn't make sense. Because, and moreover, the common currency was a decision, was a political decision by France and by Germany, and not a decision which was deducted from an economic reasoning of an economic theory. And what we do now, we try to bring together how to build up a building on a decision which was done out of any economical logic. Would you agree with? I don't know whether you understood what I mean.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you raised some enormous issues. One way, I think, of looking at it is to say that there are indeed these large differences between countries, large differences in how the economies behave, perform, their histories and so forth. And how far can one address those differences in policy terms? How does one let me say, kind of allow for those differences? Let me think it, I'm not sure that's very clear, but let me give you an example. One of the requirements for a common single currency to continue, I would say, is that the rate of inflation in the member countries has to be very similar. If they're not, then one country's prices will rise relative to others, they will become uncompetitive, and that will then create difficulties. Now, something like that did happen. The prices in most countries rose faster than prices in Germany. The difference wasn't huge, it was 1.5% a year, but over 10 years it accumulated. Now, knowing that that's a problem, one could address it either by saying, well, everything will work out fine. People will realise that they are in a single currency. Firms will realise that they can't raise their prices faster than their competitors in other countries. Workers will realise that they have to modify their wage claims and so forth. And I may be overstating the case, but there was, I think, a strong element of people thinking in that sort of way when the single currency was launched. It's not an issue we have to address, it will look after itself. Now, the alternative is to say, well, what are the policies which could address those differences? Now, one which has been suggested, which is that there is some form of at least wage not wage negotiation, but discussions at the European level to try to ensure that the way in which wages and prices evolve in the member countries are in some sense consistent with one another. Now, to bring that about is going to be very difficult, but one has to think through, well, there have to be policies then really designed to address that sort of issue. I think similar in a different direction in terms of, for example, over the fiscal policy, I suppose there are two sorts of issues arising there. One is that countries come with different, not just countries, but come with different views about what is the appropriate way to conduct fiscal policy. For example, some countries will go the fiscal consolidation, balancing the budget, others will take a more relaxed attitude towards it. But when you're coming together in a single currency, in effect, you can't have those sorts of policies, so one is going to dominate over the other, and in this case it was the fiscal consolidation view, balancing the budget view, which dominated. So in the formation of the single currency, one has to realise that there are differences in perception about policies from the member governments. Yet somehow they've got to be reconciled, and that one is going probably in the end to dominate. But the second aspect is to recognise that, or to acknowledge that governments and countries do have different views about what is appropriate fiscal policy, and to some extent say, well, that's the way it is. Let's try and impose a common set of policies on them, but rather see whether we can coordinate them in some ways to mutually discuss them and arrive at mutually acceptable outcomes, possibly. But I think one does have to put in, or there has to be put in place policies which recognise that there are these differences and how they're going to be dealt with. Now, at another level, perhaps, and I think I tend to come at it more from this point of view, thinking, how does a single currency, in a sense, operate inside a single country? And insofar as a currency inside a single country has been maintained, so forth, what lessons can we learn about what policies need to support that? And one, I think, which numbers would say, well, look, national governments typically operate regional policies. They operate policies which involve fiscal transfers between different regions. Is that something which is needed at the European level if a single currency is going to be maintained? I think many of us don't have to say, yes, there does need to be something like that to operate.
But the contrary is going on.
Hmm?
The contrary is going on.
Yes, sure, yes.
And why? If there is a reason, if your reasoning is alright,
Yeah.
so why exactly what is happening is the contrary of what you say? Because there is no will from the Germans of what you say.
Sure.
To change the policy.
Yes, so at least I probably take my perspective in the end, that will end in some kind of disaster. Yeah, it is difficult for me to explain why other people don't see it the same way later. Yes. But yeah, but there is clearly the limits on, for example, the transfers. Now, I think it's, again, I'm not sure how one solves it, but there have been a number of examples of where what had been separate states have come together in a single currency area, most of them associated with the British Empire, which is the United States had individual states which were then formed into the United States. Canada had separate provinces which came together, I think, in 1867. Australia had different states which came together in a federation in 1901. I think there's something to be gained from looking at their experiences and how it came about that there are significant transfers between states within Australia, provinces within Canada, which, from what people tell me, is always a matter of kind of struggle each year. But at the same time, it is broadly accepted that those transfers should take place. Now, clearly, within the European context, we're a long, long way from that, and how that would come about, I just don't see. But there are, I think, examples of where something similar has eventually occurred, but it has required the establishment of a central authority which has a whole load of political legitimacy, which is not really the case in the European Union.
Okay, now before we thank Professor Sawyer, let me make some comments or observations. And I would like to start with the issue raised by Professor Sawyer that relates to the need to treat the debt GDP ratio very cautiously. And I think we could bring in here a suggestion that was put forward by our common friend, Professor Malcolm, who in fact had been running that seminar with us last year and was present here during our last meeting. And he suggested the following. He said in his book on the myths of in economic policy making and teaching economics, that in fact we must not expect ministers of finance to reduce the debt GDP ratio, because on most of the elements that decide its value, no minister of finance in no country has full control. What we can require instead is we may ask him to run a policy that would not deteriorate the initial value of the debt to GDP ratio. Once you assume that point of view, you immediately end with the results that were put forward today by Professor Sawyer. In each country, the limit of the deficit GDP ratio, if we want not to deteriorate the initial debt to GDP ratio, will depend on the deficit ratio and on the rate of growth of GDP. And of course, the scope of maneuver would be different to each country depending on what was the initial deficit GDP ratio and what was its past rate of growth. Now, this is a specific comment, but I think we could also make some more general observations. And I think what is at stake here is the issue of whether we want to run a policy, the main purpose of which and constraint of which is an effort to secure full employment. If you start with that precondition, you need to find out what is the rate of private investment that would make your productive capacity to increase at such a rate that would allow absorbing the whole labor force at given capital output ratios, given labor productivity growth, and so on and so forth. And of course, that would be different for each and every country. But the starting point is, and this is what we hear today from Professor Sawyer, the requirement is the policy of full employment. And the question arises, what should we do if private investment is not forthcoming at a rate that would guarantee that rate of growth of capacity that would enable absorption of the whole labor force? Then it must be stimulated by public investment, or else by spending on subsidizing private consumption along the ways suggested in these 3 ways to full employment put forward by Kalecki in 1943. How it hinges, how it links to Euro survival. If we really need that type of environment that Professor Sawyer mentioned, spelled out tonight, regarding sort of political and economic federation, transfer of resources, this is a task that may require a generation to accomplish. In the period of rising nationalisms, rising all sort of quasi-fascist movements in Europe and elsewhere. In a sense, I would venture to claim that whatever we do to counter those expanding new nationalistic attitudes and nationalistic rhetoric serves the defense of the euro. Because if we want euro to survive, and if this is the general framework which is indispensable for euro to survive, I think this is also a political element of the agenda. Those would be my conclusions. I don't know whether you want to respond. If not, I think please join me in thanking Professor Sawyer for his excellent presentation. Thanks a lot, Malcolm.